Hello, and welcome to History 2023 Arkansas History. Lecture title Reconstruction Part 2. The events of 1868 constituted a turning point in the course of Reconstruction in Arkansas. On the one hand, the state was now formally back in the Union, holding regular elections and sending representatives off to Congress to take part in passing legislation and all that. On the other hand, the price of this return was that a majority of its citizens, white Democrats who had fought for or otherwise supported or been sympathetic to the Confederate cause, were effectively excluded from political life altogether, and the newly minted Republican Party, composed of several different groups which together made up only a minority of Arkansans, had a near monopoly on power. Obviously, that white Democratic majority was rather galled by this situation, and by the fact that federal soldiers continued to be garrisoned in the state even after readmission, essentially protecting the new government from its own people. In this lecture, we'll look at how the people of Arkansas, with all these internal divisions, white versus black, Democrat versus Republican, etc., got along, or more often didn't, during the remaining years of Reconstruction. Arguably the most critical question in Arkansas and the rest of the South was the status of the African American residents. Indeed, the desire to resolve that status had really fueled the shift from moderate to now radical Reconstruction. Arkansas might not have passed the restrictive black codes after the war, but other states had, preventing the ex-slaves from serving on juries, testifying against whites, leaving their employment without meeting certain requirements, in some cases even from owning land or firearms. And even Arkansas passed some pieces of legislation whose effects were especially felt among the black population. An 1867 law, for example, passed before the conservative legislature was dissolved, required laborers to sign work contracts with their employers, which they were then prohibited from breaking. This could affect members of either race, but it especially impacted black laborers who, seeking some means of supporting themselves, were drifting back to the plantations to work for wages. Legislation like this, and their general lack of resources following emancipation, left the black community in a pretty precarious position, and congressional Republicans were determined to correct that. For starters, in early 1865, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency that soon set up offices throughout the South. Its job was to provide food, clothing, medical aid, and education to those in need, mainly to the freed blacks, hence the name, though whites left impoverished by the war could also apply in many circumstances. It wasn't exactly a welfare agency in the sense that you didn't get this aid for free usually. You had to make some kind of payment in cash or in goods, unless you were sick or disabled, in which case you did usually get it for free, which promptly led to all sorts of fraud as people started faking illnesses or injuries to avoid paying. Bureau agents also worked to negotiate better labor contracts between plantation owners and the black laborers, and in a few cases, to provide land that black Arkansans could purchase and work as independent farmers, though only a few hundred of them managed to do so. The Bureau's real legacy, though, came in education, as it set up dozens of basic schools all over the state, to which ex-slaves flocked in huge numbers, eager to learn to at least read their Bible, if nothing else. You had many scenes of 7-year-olds and their 70-year-old grandparents sitting together, learning at essentially the same pace. By the time the Bureau ceased operations in Arkansas in 1869, it had provided some 40,000 black residents with the essentials of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The evolution of independent black Christian denominations, most notably the African Methodist Episcopal Church, or AME, that would provide a focus for community life in the decades ahead, was also partly a legacy of the Bureau. Being given education and material aid didn't immediately spell political and economic power for Arkansas blacks, of course, but the rise of the radical Republicans did bring about a change in this regard. As we saw last time, these guys made it a point to assist and politically empower the black community through the granting of U.S. citizenship and then of voting rights. They were motivated by a mix of idealism and political ambition, but that didn't matter to the black citizens themselves. After the 1868 Constitution was ratified, they had the vote and the right to hold office themselves, and they were ready to use it. 8 of the 70 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were themselves black, and more entered public office in the next few years. By 1873, 20 members of the state's General Assembly were African American, as were 2 of its executive officials. William Gray, a Helena businessman who was made the Commissioner of Immigration and State Lands, and Joseph Corbin, an Ohio-born educator who served as Superintendent of Public Instruction. Below the state level, you also had a number of county and other local officials who were black, especially in the Delta counties. Even if African Americans weren't voting members of their own community into office, they were casting their ballots for whites who were sympathetic to their aims. And during the late 1860s and early 1870s, the legislature enacted multiple additional civil rights laws, barring racial discrimination in public facilities and any local statutes discouraging interracial marriage. Needless to say, they also quickly ratified the 15th Amendment when it came up in 1870, ensuring the right to vote regardless of race nationwide. And all this time, too, blacks start forming or joining political organizations like the Union League to lobby for their interests, just like white citizens have been doing all along. Organizations that are based on a general platform of civic improvement, you might say. The construction of black churches and schools, addressing shortcomings in local government, demanding better law enforcement to protect themselves from hostile whites, etc. So there's a lot of political activity going on here, and just as the radicals had hoped/expected, most of it is happening in favor of the Republicans. With former Confederates now excluded from voting, blacks were going to make up a big chunk of the remaining electoral base, and most of them were motivated to support the party of Lincoln. And of the remaining white voters, a lot of them are Unionists who, driven by wartime events, are now in the Republican camp as well. So while the Democrats don't go away entirely, because some are still able to vote despite the restrictions, until almost the end of Reconstruction, the state government, both the legislative and executive branches, are completely controlled by Republicans. As for who these were, generally speaking, the Arkansas Republicans during Reconstruction were a coalition of 3 groups. There were the majority of African Americans, of course. There were the Unionist white natives, either of Arkansas or of the South more generally, and there were Northern whites, businessmen and professionals who had come south seeking economic opportunities from the rebuilding, and or former Union soldiers who had stayed on after the war for the same reasons. Because of their greater ambition, and the fact that they were naturally more trusted by the National Party leadership, it was the latter group who typically held the highest posts like governor, then worked with the other 2 to get things moving. In many ways, that was the political picture of Arkansas and the South during Reconstruction, an alliance of these 3 groups supported or protected by the federal occupation troops still stationed there. Now, one of the long-running debates over Reconstruction-era governments, ever since they came to an end, is how well they managed the state during their time. Opponents, i.e. most white Southerners, later claimed it was unending oppression and incompetence, wrecking chances for a quick economic recovery. Supporters, i.e. white and black Republicans, argued it saw significant social and economic progress that would have been still greater if Reconstruction had lasted longer. As usual, neither side is entirely right or entirely wrong. The Republican government did, indeed, lay the groundwork for long-term improvements in the infrastructure of Arkansas. One of the most visible signs of this was the expansion of the state's railroad network. By 1871, the line that had started west from Memphis before the war, and which comprised the state's entire pre-war railroad network, had been extended all the way to Little Rock, and right across the river, North Little Rock was the hub of two new lines, one north of St. Louis, the other west towards Fort Smith. By 1874, there were over 400 miles of functioning railroad track in the state, compared with less than 100 before the war. In education, too, there were significant advances. A far more comprehensive system of public education was finally put into place, building on the previous work of the Freedmen's Bureau for white and black residents alike. And for the first time, higher ed became a permanent fixture in the state. Arkansas College in Fayetteville had been one of the many casualties of the war, shutting its doors permanently. But the citizens had really liked having a college, and so they began lobbying the state to fund a replacement. In 1871, the legislature passed a bill to establish a public university, and the following January, Arkansas Industrial University, as it was then officially known, opened its doors in downtown Fayetteville with an initial class of exactly 8 students. The change to being called U of A and Go Razorbacks and all that would happen a little further down the road. These were some obvious achievements, and the legislation to keep all this afloat would be maintained by the Democrats after they later came back to power. But at the same time, even the strongest supporters of Reconstruction had difficulty claiming with a straight face that the state government was even remotely, quote-unquote, clean. As happened in other southern states, the men in Little Rock gained a reputation for fraud and embezzlement out the wazoo. As the textbook notes, taxes went through the roof, ostensibly to pay for these projects of improvement, but in many cases simply to increase their own salaries or those of their business partners or political supporters. In other cases, the Republican politicians bought huge tracts of land for a song from bankrupt planters and farmers and transferred it to corporations based in northern cities, which obviously didn't benefit Arkansas much. And even the constructive projects they backed were often tinged with corruption. In the case of the railroads, for example, a favorite trick was to organize a railroad company, promise to build a line, get state bonds to fund it, and then declare that for one reason or another you just couldn't go through with the plan, and you and your partners, and frequently the legislators who had loaned you the money in the first place, put said money in your own pockets. Of the 86 different railroad companies formed in Arkansas during Reconstruction, again, only about 400 miles or so of track existed at the end of the period, so yeah, this was pretty much happening left and right. Rackets like these were common to just about everywhere in post-Civil War America, not just in Arkansas. But because most of the Republicans' political opponents were disenfranchised, they had less fear of a backlash at the polls and thus became pretty brazen about this behavior. The fact that, despite the tax hikes, the state went from running a small surplus in 1868 to being deeply in debt at the end of Reconstruction says a lot. So how did the white Democratic majority react to all this? Well, it was kind of a mixed bag. Some held on to their social and economic position despite the reduction in wealth and political power, or even improved it. You had cases of individuals buying up the estates of bankrupt planters, improving them, and thus becoming planters themselves. And politically, there were some former Confederates who made their peace with the new order. Either they saw the Republicans as the new game in town and their best chance for personal advancement, or they thought that the generally more pro-industrial agenda of the party would be good for the state economically, or some mixture of both. However, these were very much the minority. The vast majority of white Arkansans were hotly opposed to everything about Reconstruction, which they saw as an attempt by Washington to rob them blind and make them second-class citizens, if that. And the authorities weren't doing a lot to reassure them that that was not the case. The disenfranchisement of most ex-Confederates really stuck in their craw, as you might expect, and since Republican control of the state could not have been maintained otherwise, it just reinforced their belief that this whole thing was a sham. And beyond that, they were often the target of harassment by Republicans of whatever particular group, out to punish or just humiliate them whenever possible. It's impossible to say how often such incidents occurred, but they did occur, adding insult to a whole lot of injuries. Not all the Reconstruction politicians were crooks or sadists, no more than they were all saints, but given their bitterness over losing the war, white Southerners were inclined to see them that way, and they lashed out. At the occupation troops, at the Northern politicians who had moved in and taken over, often known as carpetbaggers because it was said they had come south with everything they owned in a suitcase made from carpet scraps, at their fellow Southerners who had joined them, known as scalawags, an old term for rascal, and, often especially, at the ex-slaves in whose name so much of this was officially being done. No single person, though, seemed to infuriate them as much as Powell Clayton, the man who had replaced Isaac Murphy as governor in 1868. A Pennsylvania native who had never set foot in Arkansas before the war, when he rose to command a cavalry division and participated in most of the major battles in the state, he had settled down on a confiscated plantation near Pine Bluff after the war, married a planter's daughter, and bought up land all over the place. In short, the personification of this carpetbagger title. He was taking away their land, their social position, even their women, and they hated him for it. As it happened, Clayton would not be in Little Rock all that long, getting himself appointed as U.S. Senator in 1871, and already by that time he had moved away from his former radicalism, making more conciliatory noises towards his former enemies. But he was widely believed to be deep in all this corruption and political manipulation, and most Arkansas Democrats wanted as little to do with him as possible. And as it turned out, looking ahead just a bit, stories of his corruption and power-mongering were so widespread that even some fellow Republicans would eventually turn on him, setting up the last act of Reconstruction in the state. Of the ways in which Democrats chose to lash out, some were passive, ignoring their enemies or refusing to associate with them, etc. Others sought a more constructive route, seeking to turn the political activity of black citizens to their advantage by recruiting them to the Democrats. One of the most public voices in support of this approach was that of Thomas Heineman, who had returned to Helena after the war and, having been a red-hot supporter of slavery and secession beforehand, now called on ex-Confederates to accept the reality of citizenship for blacks and win them to their own side, creating a native cross-racial alliance that would drive out the carpetbaggers. Given the reputation Heineman had created for himself, this was a tantalizing possibility, one cut short by his assassination in 1868 under very mysterious circumstances, but which would continue to have a certain following in the years ahead. But far more infamous a response was that of active hostility, as many Southern men, especially the Confederate veterans among them, began to form vigilante organizations. Supposedly, these were to protect their communities from the anarchy and harassment of the times, and often that was part of their purpose. But increasingly, they began to focus on visiting that same anarchy and harassment on others, especially the blacks. There were many groups like these, the Knights of the White Camellia, the Red Shirts, and others, but by far the best known was the Ku Klux Klan. Founded in Tennessee in 1865 and quickly spreading to neighboring states, it started more as a social club than anything, But very quickly, it was at the forefront of this back and forth violence. It and groups like it made a habit of terrorizing black voters, destroying their property, riding to their houses at night, and making threats that sometimes included acts like burning crosses right outside. And when this didn't work, resorted to lynchings and assassinations. In response, both white and black Republicans formed quasi-legal militias that often treated their opponents in exactly the same way. This was one means by which the violence and disorder of the Civil War guerrilla activity continued, and though all corners of the state suffered from it to an extent, it was especially concentrated in the South and East, where the black population, and thus this racial animosity, was mostly located. This violence seems to have peaked in the 6 months or so following the takeover of the Clayton government in mid-1868, a period that is surely the bloodiest in all of Arkansas's Reconstruction era. We have no clear idea how many people were killed during these months, but the number certainly ran into the hundreds, as local Klansmen murdered and terrorized Republican voters and even public officials, including even U.S. Congressman James Hines, killed in an ambush in Monroe County. Meanwhile, Republican militias responded by cutting a violent swath through Democratic strongholds, and outright criminals claiming affiliation with one side or the other committed more and more acts of murder, rape, robbery, arson, and so on. There was often little distinction between militias and criminals, though. Even those who saw themselves as principled defenders of their particular side engaged in truly savage behavior on a regular basis. The violence only died down at year's end when the Republicans again triumphed at the polls, and Clayton worked with moderate Democrats to slam the lid down hard on both the Klan and some of the more out-of-control Republican militias. But that didn't undo the suffering that had already occurred, and though there was plenty of blame to go around, the whole episode acted to confirm white Democratic opinion that Republican rule meant corruption and lawlessness and had to be gotten rid of. In many ways, this story of Reconstruction can come to seem like a bit of a caricature. White and black Republicans in charge, white Democrats resentful and complaining, just waiting until they had an opportunity to take back power. But while there is a lot of truth in that picture, it leaves a lot of details out as well. Because throughout much of the latter phase of Reconstruction, the primary battles in the state were not those being fought by Arkansas Republicans against Democrats, they were those being fought by Arkansas Republicans against other Arkansas Republicans. The factional battles that would be waged throughout the late 1860s and early 1870s are every bit as confusing as the textbook indicates, with personal rivalries playing as much of a role as opposing principles, and all sides in this contest observed the enemy of my enemy is my friend rule, which, especially during the so-called Brooks-Baxter War of 1872 through 74, would make for some very strange bedfellows indeed. However, I don't think it's quite as inexplicable as some make it out to be. A lot of it really comes down to the uneasy relationship between the two groups of white Republicans, the carpetbaggers and the scalawags, the latter of whom were in an especially difficult position. They were, obviously, condemned at every turn by their Democratic neighbors for allying with the Northerners who had conquered and occupied their native land. But being a scalawag cut both ways. They were Union men, yes, but many of them were also native-born Arkansans who were deeply attached to their state and genuinely wanted to act in its best interests. The constant episodes of political corruption, the running up of more and more debt, many of them liked this no more than their partisan opponents, and more than a few of them likewise began to blame their fellow Republicans for it, especially carpetbaggers like Clayton and his supporters. There was also a national dimension to this, as the Clayton wing of the party was identified with President Grant, especially after the contentious 1868 election. As his presidency dragged on, Grant himself began to be associated with episodes of corruption and grifting. He may not have been personally involved, but he certainly turned a blind eye to those who were. So as time went on, many Arkansans, Democrat or Republican, began to see the Grant-Clayton wing of the GOP as nothing but a front for dishonesty and personal enrichment. And while the Scalawags weren't about to go over to the Democrats, they were determined to launch a challenge from within the party, restoring it to its quote-unquote original nature. As a result, by 1870 at the latest, two distinct factions had formed within the Republican ranks, both of which soon gained colorful names for themselves. The Reformist faction, whose platform was known nationally as liberal republicanism, was led in Arkansas by Joseph Brooks and came to be referred to as the Brindletails, because Brooks's voice was compared to the bellow of a brindle-tailed bull. Those who stuck with Clayton, and by extension with Grant and the National Party leadership, were dubbed minstrels, because one of its members was said to have once been a minstrel, a traveling comedic performer. Ironically, Brooks himself was a carpetbagger, an Ohio-born minister and abolitionist who had never set foot in Arkansas before the Civil War, nor was he exactly a moderate. He had been one of the earliest advocates of full civil rights for blacks and had criticized Clayton for not being radical enough. But he did agree with the Scalawags and the Democrats that Clayton and those around him had gathered way too much power into their own hands and were using and abusing it left and right, and that this really needed to change. In 1872, formally breaking with the mainstream Republicans, Brooks and his supporters held a separate convention and nominated him for governor, with a platform that included not only promises to end all this, but also a pledge to end the disenfranchisement of former Confederates, which won him the support of many, though by no means all, Democrats. The Grant-Clayton Republicans, meanwhile, nominated a Scalawag, Elisha Baxter, a North Carolina native who had become a prominent merchant and local politician in Batesville before the war. This set off the so-called Brooks-Baxter War, which, though certainly not the bloodiest episode of Arkansas Reconstruction, was definitely the most bizarre. Though the split between carpetbaggers and scalawags helps to make sense of things, the struggle seemed to violate everything people thought they knew about Reconstruction. In one corner were the Brindletails, a coalition of scalawags, Democrats, and some black voters regardless of party, championing the candidacy of a semi-radical carpetbagger. In the other corner were the minstrels, consisting mainly of carpetbaggers and other black voters, running a scalawag who before the war had owned slaves, at one time had been a Hindman supporter, and had served in both Union and Confederate units during the war. If the 1868 election had been organized chaos, this was just chaos. We'll never know exactly what the true outcome of the election was because the published results were almost certainly fake. Officially, Baxter defeated Brooks by a margin of just over 3,000 votes out of 80,000 cast total, but the fact that the registrars and election judges worked for the Clayton political machine makes those numbers highly suspect. There was nothing much the Brindletail camp could do about it at the moment, though. The minstrels controlled both houses of the state legislature and quickly certified the results. A suit Brooks filed against Baxter got bogged down in court, and Baxter was sworn in as Arkansas's 10th governor in early 1873. That was by no means the end of it, though. Probably, the minstrels should have given more consideration to the fact that their man had held every political position conceivable in the past, because once he got into office, Baxter proved to be just as erratic. Perhaps reasoning that he could shore up his shaky power base by stealing some of Brooks's thunder, he quickly announced that he too was in favor of restoring voting rights to the ex-Confederates, which might work out for him personally, but represented a serious long-term threat to the minstrels as a group. They might have been willing to swallow this by itself. After all, Clayton had endorsed such a move when he was governor towards the end. But then he began turning on some of their economic programs. Specifically, in early 1874, he refused to sign legislation extending more bonds to the Arkansas Central Railroad and openly questioned the legality of all such bond programs. The Minstrels had put a lot of effort behind these bonds as the key to infrastructure building in Arkansas, and if half the stories being spread by their opponents were true, they and their northern business cronies stood to lose heavily, personally and politically, if that aid didn't go through. It was at this point that Clayton and other minstrel leaders decided to cut Baxter loose. Reasoning that Brooks was, at least, a supporter of the bond issue, they maneuvered with state judges to get his case moving forward again, and on April 15th, the case of Brooks versus Baxter was finally decided in favor of Brooks. At once, Brooks, the Pulaski County Sheriff, and an armed mob marched into the governor's office and forcibly evicted Baxter. This was about the point at which the Brooks-Baxter War crossed the line and became an actual war. Denouncing the action as illegitimate, Baxter holed up at a hotel a few blocks away and declared martial law in Little Rock, while Brooks began barricading the State House and ordered a couple of cannon aimed at Baxter's HQ, just in case, of course. Both sides began calling on support from militia, and by the 20th, about 2 armed bands of about 1,000 men each, crossing every imaginable fault line in the state, brindletail, minstrel, Republican, Democrat, white, black, were facing off in the streets of the capital. A number of casualties resulted over the next day or two, and if not for the presence of federal troops and their commander making it clear he would do whatever he had to maintain order, there is no telling what would have happened. As it was, Brooks and Baxter's armies, that's really all you can call them at this point, fought a number of small battles in Arkansas, Jefferson, and Lonoke counties, while officers on both sides were digging out weapons not used since the Civil War and threatening to turn Little Rock into a battlefield. Again, we are talking about members of every single group, regardless of race or politics, being represented in each of these two camps. So, yeah, this will take everything you think you know about Reconstruction and stand it on its head. Finally, in mid-May, the U.S. Attorney General issued a judgment that Baxter was the legal governor, and President Grant, who, like everyone else, just wanted the whole thing over with, declared that he, Grant, would aid him, Baxter, in suppressing Brooks's insurrection, as it was called. The Brindletail forces dispersed. Brooks, as an olive branch, was offered and accepted the job of postmaster in Little Rock, and that was that. The events of May 1874, then, marked the end of the 2-year-long Brooks-Baxter War and in favor of Baxter. But as it turned out, they also, for all intents and purposes, marked the end of Reconstruction. Keep in mind, throughout this period, all its twists and turns, one thing has been the same. White Democrats, who had fought for or been sympathetic to the Confederacy, constituted a solid majority of Arkansas's population. The only reason they didn't control its political life was because many of them were legally barred from casting ballots, and the events of the past 6 years had made it clear that they were not at all unwilling to take up arms in protest of a state government they saw as fundamentally illegitimate. Ultimately, then, Reconstruction rested on the presence of federal troops in the state to protect the Republican regime and the willingness of the men in D.C. to make use of them. And by 1874, that willingness was in terminal decline. After 13 years of war and Reconstruction, the Northern public was tired of committing resources to keep the South in line. They were satisfied by now that if Southern Democrats got back into power, they were not going to try to secede all over again, which was all most people cared about. They certainly weren't going to keep it up just to ensure racial equality. Prejudice against blacks was just as common there as in the South, and in some northern states, getting the 14th and 15th Amendments passed had been a very hard slog. Besides, the evidence of corruption and graft had deeply discredited the Republicans, moderates and radicals alike, in many quarters. So as long as slavery and secession were dead letters, and everyone agreed that they were content to let the South handle its own affairs. These facts had already become evident to Democratic leaders, now calling themselves Redeemers, in the sense that their goal was to redeem the South from years of Republican oppression. Though Arkansas Redeemers had been active in the Brooks-Baxter War, on both sides somewhat embarrassingly, they would just as soon be rid of minstrels and brindle-tails alike. And they were aware that many in the state were exhausted and disgusted by the conflict, and that, even though he was the official victor, Baxter's standing had been deeply undermined. So as the Brooks-Baxter War wound down, the Redeemers began working to exploit this Republican division to the max. Their de facto leader at this point was Augustus H. Garland, a Little Rock lawyer who had served in the Confederate Congress during the war and established a reputation, then and during Reconstruction, as something of a moderate. During the recent kerfluffle, he had allied with Baxter, then used his influence to pressure the governor to hold another constitutional convention that would fix, as he saw it, the 1868 version. Baxter, who seems to have fallen ill from the strain of his battle with Brooks, agreed, and in the summer of 1874, the convention met and drafted a new constitution, which weakened the power of the governor, strengthened the power of the counties and other local authorities, and, critically, it removed all remaining restrictions on the voting rights of ex-Confederates. The draft was put to a statewide vote in October and approved by a 3-to-1 margin, making it Arkansas's fifth, and as it turned out, final constitution. There would be unsuccessful attempts to pass a new one in 1918, 1970, and 1980, but the 1874 Constitution is what we still have today. Immediately afterward, new elections for the state government were held, and just as everyone had known would happen, the Democratic Redeemers ran the table. Garland himself was swept in as governor, and the Democrats took every other executive position, as well as decisive majorities in the General Assembly. The loose ends would not be wrapped up until early the next year, as a few diehard Republicans in Washington were still hoping to achieve federal intervention, but the government soon decided not to. 3 or 4 other southern states would remain under Republican control for a couple more years, but as far as Arkansas was concerned, Reconstruction was over. Before wrapping up this already way too long video, I want to stress that the end of Reconstruction in Arkansas did not mean the abrupt end of one era and the beginning of another. It's often implied that everything having to do with the period was instantly undone the moment white Democrats got back into power, and it wasn't. Not anywhere in the South, especially not in this state, where, as the Brooks-Baxter War had demonstrated, every racial and political divide had been crossed by the end. Many of the Republican reforms, such as funding for railroads and education, were left in place, and so too, in many cases, was the relative degree of civil rights for blacks, for far longer than might have been expected. At the same time, though, with a Democratic majority now firmly reestablished in Little Rock, it was clear that any further questions on these issues would be answered on the Redeemers' terms. That would continue to be the case for the rest of the 19th century and beyond, as Arkansas moved into the era typically referred to as the New South.